A supreme leader is dead. 20 million barrels of oil stopped moving overnight. And the man who promised America no more foreign wars just launched the biggest military operation since Baghdad fell. Operation Epic Fury is 1 week old. Washington is calling it a success. But there is a version of this story being told at press briefings, and a different version arriving in oil futures, naval tracking systems, and the voting data of 7 swing states. They are not the same story. 7 days ago, this waterway never stopped moving. It could not afford to. Roughly 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed anywhere on Earth passes through this single corridor, 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Then the bombs fell, and the tankers stopped. Within 72 hours of the first American strikes on Iranian soil, Tehran announced the suspension of all commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Not a warning, not a threat, an announcement already in effect. Stock markets on 3 continents registered the news before most people had finished their morning coffee. But here is the detail that separates this conflict from every other American military escalation in recent memory. This was not a response to an attack. No American lives were lost in the days before the strikes. No imminent threat was formally documented. This war was a choice. The largest American military operation since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it began not with a crisis, but with a decision. The name alone signals confidence. Epic Fury. It is the language of certainty, of a plan already completed in someone's mind. What it does not signal, 7 days into the actual war, is what comes after the fury ends. That is the question no press briefing has answered. Not can we win the opening battle, but what does winning actually look like? To understand why that question is so difficult to answer, you need to go back to what this president told the American people before the first bomb fell, before the carrier groups moved, before the name Epic Fury existed. Because what he promised then and what he is doing now are not the same thing. He said it clearly, repeatedly, at rallies, in interviews, in the language of a man who had watched previous administrations bleed America dry in wars with no exit. No more stupid wars, no more endless conflicts, no more American soldiers dying in countries that most Americans could not find on a map. That was the promise, and it won him the White House twice. Then, in the first week of March 2026, he launched Operation Epic Fury. No American lives had been lost in the days before the strikes. No imminent attack on U.S. soil had been documented. No Allied territory had been breached. The war did not begin because Iran moved first. It began because Washington decided it should. That distinction between reacting to a threat and choosing to create one will define how history judges this moment. In military terms, the first week belonged to the United States. Khamenei was killed. Iranian forces took coordinated hits across land, sea, and air within 72 hours. The battlefield results were, by any conventional measure, decisive. And yet, the analysts were uneasy. Because in every previous American conflict, the opening week also looked decisive. That is not the week that defines a war. On the scoreboard of the first 7 days, the United States was winning. That much was not in dispute. But military analysts were not asking whether the United States could win the opening battle. They already knew that answer. The question being asked in think tanks, in foreign ministries, and in the back channels of every Gulf state watching this unfold was something far harder. What happens the morning after? Wars rarely stay where they start. That is not pessimism. It is the most consistent lesson in the history of modern conflict. Every major Middle East escalation of the past 30 years began with a defined target and a contained objective. Every single one grew beyond those boundaries within weeks. Iran's regional architecture was built precisely for this moment. Not to win a conventional war against the United States. Iran knows it cannot. But to make the cost of that war felt everywhere simultaneously. The question is, how many places everywhere actually includes? The answer to that is what the next few weeks will determine. Iran has spent 2 decades constructing a network of armed proxy relationships across the region: Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. Each group receiving weapons, funding, and strategic direction from Tehran. With Khamenei dead and the Iranian state absorbing the shock of the strikes, each of those networks now faced an identical calculation: absorb the blow quietly, or respond in a way that proved they still existed. In the days following the initial strikes, militia groups across Iraq signaled readiness for retaliation against American installations. Naval assets in the Gulf began repositioning. The silence from Hezbollah in Lebanon was the kind that precedes a statement, not the kind that follows acceptance. Killing a supreme leader does not kill a system. That distinction matters enormously and gets lost in the momentum of early battlefield reports. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps remained largely intact after the first week of strikes. Its institutional knowledge, its weapons engineers, its regional relationships, none of that disappears with a change in leadership. If anything, a leadership vacuum in a heavily armed ideological state tends to produce not stability, but competition for succession. History has a long record on this specific scenario. Remove a leader without dismantling the conditions that produced him, and those conditions find a new face. But the most immediate danger from a spreading conflict was not military. It was about a corridor of water, 33 kilometers wide, and what the world had already lost access to. 20% of the world's daily oil supply stopped. And the economic consequences of that single fact were only beginning to arrive. The Strait of Hormuz is not a strategic abstraction. It is a physical place, a corridor of open water between Iran and Oman, 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Every single day before this war began, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil moved through that corridor. That is approximately 1 in every 5 barrels consumed anywhere on Earth by factories, hospitals, airlines, heating systems, and supply chains on every continent. When Iran suspended commercial traffic through the strait, that number did not slow. It stopped. And the world had 72 hours before the first economic signals began arriving. Stock markets on 3 continents registered the Hormuz closure before most government briefings had even begun. Oil futures spiked within hours. Shipping insurance rates were the detail that stopped traders. The numbers moved to levels last seen in the opening weeks of the 2003 Iraq invasion. For anyone who remembered what followed that, it was not a reassuring comparison. Italy was already weighing emergency fuel tax cuts within days of the conflict escalating. European energy firms were issuing warnings about sustained price surges. These were not projections. These were responses to what had already happened in the first week. Here is what made the Hormuz closure different from every other economic risk in this conflict. It did not require escalation to cause damage. The closure itself had already set forces in motion that no military success could reverse. A sustained closure of 2 weeks would produce energy price increases across every import-dependent economy on Earth. That includes most of Europe, large parts of Asia, and emerging markets with no political stake in the Iran conflict whatsoever. Central banks that spent 3 years suppressing inflation would face a new source of price pressure they had no monetary tool to address, because you cannot raise interest rates against a blocked waterway. Every one of these economic consequences carries a political address. Higher energy prices are not abstract numbers. They arrive as heating bills, petrol costs, and grocery receipts. And in the United States, they arrive in an election year. November 2026 is 8 months away. The midterm elections will ask American voters a straightforward question, not about Iran, not about the Strait, but about whether their lives feel better or worse than they did before the bombs fell. The MAGA coalition is not a monolith. It never has been. Inside it live 2 instincts that have coexisted uneasily since Trump first ran: loyalty to the man and skepticism of the machine he now commands. For the first week of epic fury, loyalty was winning. Polls showed Republican support holding. The base was following the president's lead, as it had done before on decisions that looked unusual from the outside. But underneath that surface solidarity, a second calculation was forming. The anti-interventionist wing of the movement, the voters who cheered loudest when Trump promised to end foreign wars, was watching the same battlefield reports as everyone else and reaching different conclusions. Beyond the base, the numbers were telling a more uncomfortable story. Independent voters, the bloc that determines the outcome of almost every contested American election, were registering significant opposition to the war. Not discomfort, not hesitation, opposition. That is a different word. And in a midterm election year, it is a dangerous one. The comparison Republican strategists kept returning to privately was Iraq, March 2003. A popular president, a decisive military opening, an enemy capital taken in under 3 weeks, approval ratings that held above 60% for months. Every one of those facts was true, and every one of them preceded 18 months of erosion that reshaped American politics for a decade. One Republican strategist put it with unusual clarity this week. The American people, he said, are not interested in repeating the mistakes of Iraq and Afghanistan. The White House has stated its objectives clearly: destroy the missile infrastructure, dismantle the Navy, sever the proxy networks, prevent the nuclear path. On paper, those are defined goals. But the question that comes after all 4 objectives are achieved: what does Iran look like the morning after? Who leads it? Does the region stabilize or fracture further? That question remains unanswered at every briefing. And in the history of American military campaigns, the wars that ended well are precisely the ones where that question had an answer before the first bomb fell. Operation Epic Fury is 7 days old. The opening strikes have landed. The supreme leader is gone. The strait is closed. And still, not one person in a position of authority has answered the oldest question in military strategy. Every major American military campaign of the past 35 years began with a defined objective, a confident opening, and a press briefing that used the word decisive. Every single one. The objectives in Afghanistan were clear. The objectives in Iraq were clear. The objectives in Libya were clear. In each case, the military phase succeeded on its own terms, and the question of what came after arrived like a debt nobody had budgeted for. Operation Epic Fury is 7 days old. The supreme leader is gone. The strikes have landed. The proxy networks are calculating their response. The strait remains closed. The economic signals are already moving through markets that have no vote in any of this. And in Washington, the objectives are still being recited at press briefings with the same confidence they were recited on day one. The oldest question in military strategy is not, can we win? Armies have always been able to answer that. It is not, should we fight? Governments have always found a rationale for that too. The question that determines whether a war ends or simply transforms into something longer and more expensive is simpler than both of those. It is just 3 words. What comes next? 7 days ago, the Strait of Hormuz was open. Today, the world is waiting to find out who pays the real price and whether anyone thought it through before the first order was given. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? And do you think this war ends in weeks or drags on for years? If this video made you think, share it with one person who needs to see it. And if you want the next breakdown the moment it drops, subscribe, because this story is not finished.